And so what did happen? Because it's such a mystery to me about the sort of the lost month of preparation. Certainly, I mean, in many countries, and certainly in the US, where we are, were you on the phone to people during early February, late January, early February, saying, guys, what's going on? This is a really big deal. What are we doing? What was happening behind the scenes during that period?
Well, you'd like to have government money show up for the key activities. We put out 100 million. We created the therapeutics accelerator. I think there's the period before this shows up where we should have done more. There's the period between when we realized it was transmitting and now where we should have done more.
Why, with more than a month's notice? I mean, there are so many smart epidemiologists in the US, for example. You plug numbers about infectiousness and fatality into any simulation, and you see that if you don't do anything, millions of people will die. And there's a month. So what's your explanation for what do you think happened here as to why there was almost no test? A month later, there was no viable test in the US. Was this just government complexity, too many chefs in the kitchen? Was there a top-down directive? What on earth happened here?
Well, we certainly didn't take advantage of the month of February. That's how you know the testing is everything, because that's how you know whether you need to do more shutdown or you're starting to get to the point where you can relieve it. So you're blind when you have just randomly deciding who gets access to the testing capacity.
Some people are trying to argue now that, right, like a lot of people are concerned that the price of victory by isolating everyone is that you crash the economy, and that we have to be basically at home, not doing our regular jobs for 3-6 months, maybe all year. And so much so that there's now this big debate in the US and other countries about this may just be the wrong strategy, that we can't crash the economy that badly. We should only isolate for another couple of weeks and then let people back. And if that means, a lot of other people get sick and we eventually build up herd immunity, that may be the right way to go. What's your thought on this? Is it possible to find a middle way? What is the isolation strategy that eventually leads to us getting back to normal?
There really is no middle ground. And it's very tough to say to people, hey, keep going to restaurants, go. Well, if you act when you have, hundreds of cases, you may be able to contain it by doing great testing and great contact tracing and restricting foreigners coming in without as much damage to your economy. And so the people who use February well, which include Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, they, right now, it looks like are not going to have lots and lots of cases. The US has passed this opportunity to control without shutdown. We need to shut down so that the worst case of what was happening in Wuhan in the beginning or in northern Italy, over the last few weeks, that we avoid that. But we did not act fast enough to have an ability to avoid the shutdown. Until we came up with the self-swab and showed FDA that that's equivalent, we were thinking the people who might be able to man those kiosks would be the recovered patients, because they could give the test, like one a minute, versus somebody who had to change their protective gear, which is also in short supply, would take like 20 minutes per test. Now that we have the self-swab, we don't need it for that. But you're right, recovered people are kind of magical. And, for key jobs, even where you might have some exposure, it might be useful. Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people. To be clear, we're trying through the shutdown in the United States to not get to 1% of the population infected. Eventually, what we'll have to have is certificates of who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person, because you don't want people moving around the world where you'll have some countries that won't have it under control. Sadly, you don't want to completely block off the ability for those people to go there and come back and move around. So eventually there will be sort of this digital immunity proof that will help facilitate the global reopening up.
Bill, is your foundation helping to accelerate the manufacture of these self-test swabs, nasal swabs? So how can what are the prospects for really seeing scale on some of this testing soon? Not just in the US, but globally.
Yeah, our foundation, we'd been funding a thing called the flu study to really understand how respiratory viruses spread. It's amazing how little was understood. The wild card is how well can the developing countries deal with this?
I mean, if you're in a country where you have the majority of your populations making less than $2 or $3 a day, can you even afford a strategy that looks like basically shutting down the economy? Isn't there a real chance in that scenario that you lose far more deaths from hunger than from this virus?
Yeah, I mean, people will go out and seek food, and your safety net, your excess food production. We need very little of our workers to actually make the food that we eat, and we've got to make sure we do that well. But it's not that hard for rich countries, and so I'm impressed that India is acting on this. But I don't think they'll be able to reduce the inter-household spread nearly to the degree that a rich country who's doing their shutdown well. And so I'm very worried that unless we get the new tools, or for the Northern Hemisphere countries, they get time from seasonality. I'm very worried that there will be a massive number of deaths in those poor countries because the health systems just aren't, the number of respirators, hospitals.
One, there's lots of people who are really interested to hear about the kind of work that you're doing with your foundation as far as distributing tests, but also producing safety gear, masks, and that sort of thing to help with this effort for health workers.
Yeah, so the Gates Foundation, we very early on gave out $100 million to help out with all the pieces, the testing piece, the therapeutics, and the vaccines. We are not experts in making masks and ventilators and gowns, and it's great that other people, including some 3D printing and open source things, that is great. Our focus, like this self-swab thing, nobody had done that before. People thought it wouldn't work. We were quite sure it would work. And so that for the globe is a huge thing, that the front end of testing can be this fairly simple swab that you don't infect health workers as you do it. And so, we're on the phone with we work a lot with both governments and private sector. So in some ways we're kind of a bridge. And, so we've been talking to the head of the pharmaceutical company. And it's really amazing when we talk to private sector partners, their interest in helping out has been absolutely fantastic. And, so that's where we have a unique role. We also do a lot of the modeling. And so the idea of getting, the imperial model that people know has some negative assumptions in it that I hope are not right and aren't, wouldn't allow China to do as well as they want. So getting people to see, okay, what are these modeling telling us? Getting people scared enough, which the imperial model is very good at that, but not, so concerned that, hey, can we ever do an opening up? Which that would be pretty mind-blowing if you had to wait until you had a vaccine. I mean, that then, food supply, electricity, a lot of things are very difficult to maintain. So that anyway, the countries like South Korea and China, that those are positive data points on the idea that you can damp infections to tiny numbers.
That's great. And I mean, and the other question that we're just seeing a ton of before we wrap up here is just people are really interested in your insight.
Yeah, it's interesting how much of this distraction will delay the urgent innovation agenda that exists over in climate. You know, I have freed up a lot of time to work on climate. I have to say, you know, for the last few months, that's now shifted. And until we get out of this crisis, COVID will dominate. And so some of the climate stuff, although it'll still go on, it won't get that same focus. As we get past this, yes, that idea of innovation and science and the world working together, that is totally common between these two problems. And so I don't think this has to be a huge setback for climate. And in fact, I think it can be a helpful guide of, on scientists, you know, where are you seeing disaster looming, and let's make sure that doesn't happen.
So last question, there